And I'd like to introduce the speaker who's going to be delivering the keynote address, Sanford Saunders. He's the co-managing shareholder at Greenberg Traurig in Washington, D.C. Mr. Saunders is a senior member of the white-collar defense lawyer and litigator with a focus on international and energy matters. He represents corporations, individuals, and elected officials in cases including allegations of fraud, money laundering, and corruption. His most high-profile client is the former chairman of Yukos Oil Company, billionaire Mikhail Khodorkovsky. He represented Mr. Khodorkovsky in 2 criminal trials in Moscow. The second was the largest money laundering case ever prosecuted, as well as a related securities action file in the federal court in New York. He also is a visiting fellow at the George Mason University Center on Terrorism, Transnational Crime and Corruption, and an executive advisory board member at the International Leaders Summit.
Thank you and good morning. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be back here for the 2nd annual Jerusalem Leaders Summit. And it cannot go any further without joining in acknowledging the work of Natasha and Joel. This has become a labor of love for them, and it was not without their commitment that we wouldn't be here today. So we all need to recognize them. We have an ambitious agenda for today, focusing on geopolitical and economic issues. The opening topic and a theme that you will hear throughout the day, you've already heard it, is continuous references to the rule of law. It's often spoken about, sometimes mentioned in somewhat hallowed terms. Trying to define it is a little tricky, but in general, it's about setting up a system of objective principles and rules that allow us to interact, whether in our own state or as now we become more international. The goal being the phrase that emerged, everyone's equal under the law. It's supposed to help us. The earliest research, I did some research, the earliest reference I could find was in 431 BC at the funeral of Pericles. Comments were made about the concept of everyone being equal and having a fair opportunity if the laws were applied to everyone the same way. I like to think we've made some strides but had some setbacks since the Peloponnesian War. We keep trying. The rule of law promotes several things. It promotes equality and it promotes opportunity in society. It promotes opportunity in economy, and it promotes opportunity and the integrity of our political institutions, if it's working properly. Alternatively, in the opposite of the functioning of the rule of law, you have corruption, you have disillusionment, and you have economic inefficiency. The disillusionment is terrible because if people don't think society is functioning and moving forward, they step back and they step out, and that's not good. Economic inefficiency is bad. We're trying to help people improve their lives throughout the world. So the corruption and the other issues that go with the absence of the rule of law is a setback for these honorable goals. It's particularly poignant to be able to address this in Israel, a democracy, certainly the strongest democracy and possibly the only democracy, true democracy in the Middle East, in a society where it might be easier to try to not have equality under the law for certain short-term objectives. Israel has done a wonderful job of focusing on the rule of law and working within it. As Joe mentioned, it's easy to stand in courtrooms in the U.S., courtrooms in other parts of the world and talk about the rule of law. It's nice to get out and do it in a country, in front of people, and think about what it's like to go to the rest of the world. I had the privilege to represent Mikhail Khodorkovsky in 2 trials in Russia, and if you didn't appreciate the rule of law beforehand, spend the better part of about 6 years working on that, and you come out with a real appreciation and an understanding of what a difference it makes. And it really does warrant the efforts that people were putting forward to push the rule of law. And this year we saw some great headway for the rule of law. While they're political movements, Brexit is a great testament to the rule of law. And in case some people made reference to it already, the United States had an election and you may have heard Donald Trump is going to be the 45th president of the United States. In both of these instances, the rule of law is key, because you had a process that allowed people to come and vote, allowed people to do something that was not necessarily seen to be mainstream. It turned out to be popular, but there was a system in place to let it work. And if you look on the timeline of both events, you can see opportunities where people didn't like it, the traditional political elite wanted to change it, wanted to short-circuit it, but it didn't happen. And what people could fall back, what the UKIP party, what the Trump campaign, and others could fall back on was the system and the rule of law, and knowing that these rules would be applied. And it's very interesting, one of the key issues that came up in the US campaign was the issue of candidate Clinton's emails and the server, and whether she should be prosecuted and whether it should happen during an election. And whatever you feel about that issue, an interesting announcement was made yesterday by the Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, who has now acknowledged that it was a mistake for her to have the conversation with ex-President Clinton on, in the airplane hangar in Phoenix, where they bumped into each other during a trip. Because the symbolism in that was that you could influence, there was the risk, the appearance that you could influence a decision by the government as to whether somebody should be prosecuted through political position and political privilege. And this is not a statement, who knows what they talked about? It doesn't matter. The conversation itself, the fact that it existed, was dangerous. And to Attorney General Lynch's credit, she acknowledged that yesterday. Now, on the bad side for the rule of law this year, we saw the Panama Papers that came out and show that there are still a lot of people around the world who understand how to work within systems and evade some of the laws that govern corruption, govern political events, govern economic events. And you've seen a lot of several organizations, the OECD being one of them, and departments of justice and ministries of justice around the world, working to try to implement new laws and treaties to try to get everybody back on a level playing field. And that takes me to some of the trends that we're seeing in the other event, a significant publication that came out from the George Mason University, from the Center on Transnational Crime, Terrorism, and Corruption, was a study on something known as Radistivo in Russia, which is the systematic theft of businesses through the use of the criminal law enforcement system and the political system. And it's now being talked about and identified as it's easier, in many instances in Russia, instead of building a business, it's easier to steal it. And it starts with targeting, you can target a rival, you can go to local prosecutors and you can pay them to have criminal charges brought against your competitor. I've never seen it, but I have had experts testify to the fact that they've actually seen lists. So a murder charge costs X, corporate fraud costs Y. We all think about it, and how do you pay? Corruption is paying people off to get away, to be acquitted on charges. And the corruption we're talking about now is the ability to use the system to manipulate the rule of law, the appearance of regularity, and turn it against your adversaries. And then, of course, you have judges who are corrupt. You have a corrupt bankruptcy system. You throw your opponent into bankruptcy. You have phony appraisals done on the value of their assets. And the next thing you know, the assets are gone. They're with their competitors, and other people are living very well where they had no apparent source of that kind of income separately. What was really frightening was that this has now been written up. You can get the paper on the George Mason website. It's an extensive review, giving numerous examples and talking about it as, unfortunately, what has become an accepted practice. And that's the problem. When it becomes so embedded into the system that it overtakes the rule of law. And one of the One of the Russian lawyers I had the privilege to work with, and is one of the senior members of the Moscow bar, made the statement that it's not that Russia has bad laws. It's the flaws in the institutions and the individuals that implement them that's creating the problem. He has no problem with how the system has been set up. So what you've seen in response, people are trying to fight back, and you have, on the corruption side, for example, the vast expansion of international criminal prosecutions over corruption cases. You saw the case brought in Brazil involving senior executives at the Brazilian state-owned oil company Petrobras, which led to certain senior politicians having to resign, sent wide shockwaves through that country, an institution that was supposed to be impermeable. We've seen the prosecutions of people, the arrests and prosecutions of executives involved with FIFA. Those still remain mostly allegations. There haven't been any trials. So we'll see what happens there, but it shows the expanse of the cooperation of international law enforcement officials. In addition, you've seen the expansion of courts around the world being willing to expand their jurisdiction to allow those that function in countries where the legal system may be handicapped, where they feel they can't get justice, that they can come out of their country and come to the United States, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, bring suits and try to use the old-fashioned court system in these countries to try to get justice. And the U.S. has been very aggressive about allowing jurisdiction over individuals. One of the things that's, no matter what anybody says about the United States, it seems that people who want to invest money and hide money like to bring it to the United States and buy real estate. And the United States courts have made very clear that if you're bringing the proceeds of a crime to the United States, you are subject to jurisdiction in the United States. It's now spilling over to the civil system and allowing individuals to file suits to bring people to the United States or other courts. One I want to point out is a case that is being litigated or just was completed in the Netherlands. It involved the Yukos Oil Company in a lawsuit against Rosneft, the Russian state-owned oil company, when it tried to take over Yukos in bankruptcy. The Dutch court took the amazing step to declare that the Russian bankruptcy violated international law, and they refused to recognize it. And what came out in the Financial Times approximately 6 weeks ago was a story about an Armenian judge who came forward and testified in that case, how he was pressured by Armenian officials and Russian officials to change his rulings on cases in Armenia, where Yukos had a subsidiary that held in excess of $2 billion. And he was forced to change those decisions when he inadvertently, or applying the law, ruled in Yukos's favor. He was then forced off the bench and forced to flee the country. I was happy to finally read about it in the press because myself and one of my colleagues, we were the two lawyers who negotiated the deal with the judge to leave Armenia and to come forward and testify. It was a tough thing to do. It was a courageous thing to do. But this is what will help turn the situation. As everybody's moving forward, and you see bilateral investment treaties, you have different ways to bring the rule of law into these situations. There is hope for the international economic community in this regard. And I hope everybody enjoys the rest of the second annual summit and finds takeaways from the rest of the speakers. There'll be a lot of interesting things being said.